I'm Rick Bowles. Recently retired as the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of Merck, the pharmaceutical company. And I worked there for 38 years before retiring in a wide variety of positions. My background and training from the university is technical. I'm an engineer by training. I have a PhD from Princeton. So, I practiced engineering as a professional for many years before going into management. I'm still very active in engineering circles with advisory boards on different universities and things like that. And that's sort of the career part, if you will, the work part of my life. And then the second part of it, which probably is more interesting and more important, is that I became a student of Buddhism about 20 years ago, really. And that practice grew and grew. To the point where when I describe who I am now, it's not my degrees and my background and my training. It's really about being a Zen practitioner. And that wasn't something that was very romantic to me at the time. It just was something that was sort of curious, and it grew and grew and grew, and has become quite a deep interest at this point. Yeah, so those are sort of the defining parts of me. So the application of my learnings in the area of Buddhism and my practice has been a journey in itself. When I began, I was fascinated by the East. I would traveled a lot to Japan. I've been to China many times, Vietnam, Thailand, India, many different countries in the East repeatedly, and was intrigued by what was very clearly a different world philosophy in many of those places. Right? It came out in different ways, but often in business discussions and just very different views of a proposed project or a way of looking at one's work. So I became very intrigued by it. And my generation was a generation in which Eastern practices became very popular, and so that's the generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s. And so our generation as a whole was fascinated by practices from the East, and famous people, often musicians, adopted Eastern practices, and being young and impressionable, we kind of followed suit in many ways. So as this practice developed, it became something that was quiet for me in terms of the comparison with my work life. I worked and I was interested in this, and the interest moved from being curious and academic to one of really belief and adopting, in a sense, the practices and the philosophies as I learned more about it. And in my public life, if you will, that resulted in a lot more discussion about it in public circles, especially at work. So that kind of transfer of very private, new, mysterious religion, right, that would usually raise eyebrows, to being very openly or very openly discussing it was a very interesting transformation in itself, because through the middle of that, there was this great desire to explain people what I was doing. Kind of like if you find some form of exercise, it's really unbelievable. You want to show up on Monday and tell your friends and coworkers, right, or students in your case, what you did. Like, there's this great new machine in the gym and it's really awesome, right, whatever. And so there was that kind of great sense of wanting to share in the workplace, but religion's a really sensitive thing to start talking about in the workplace. So that transition and journey was a rough one, in that some people really didn't want to hear about it, and some people were a little worried about having a boss who had a religion radically different than the kind of religions you find in the West. So I've had to really, through many years, find the right sort of sweet spot for how you manage that whole thing, and not like leading with it in a sense, but then again not obscuring it, right? Yeah. My kids, who are in their late 20s and early 30s, are not practitioners, but they've come to understand what I do and appreciate it. Not when they were younger. I think when they were younger, just like young kids, just like many people that want to be a part of a community, they saw it, I think, in many ways as a threat to being a part of, a local, rural school environment. And, people go to local churches and not to distant monasteries. So I think for them it was in some ways a point of tension. But, that's early on, secondary school and elementary school stuff. Once they went to college, I think they saw much more in it and are very close to all of the practitioners in the community I practice in, and to the religious teachers as well. So that has made a very nice kind of transition for them. Yeah. I am a Zen practitioner. I practice at Zen Mountain Monastery, which is a monastery that was founded about 30 years ago by a first-generation Zen teacher who came from Japan, Maizumi Roshi. There at this conference are several people from that same lineage. I've seen from the overheads they're using in their presentations and things like that. And the monastery has about 300 very active participants, students, maybe 15 monks, 2 main teachers, and 2 centers, one in Brooklyn in New York City, and the other near Woodstock, New York, in Mount Tremper, New York. The monastery is an old Lutheran church, huge old stone church, the kind of stone that's on this building, very classical in structure. And it was originally a Christian facility and still has a Christ figure that we maintain on the outside of the church. We strive to be a word that we use a lot is authentic in Zen practice. So in the past couple of decades, Zen has gotten very popular. It's gotten very abused. And so people who have spent a night in a monastery will write a book about the Zen experience, not really understanding the Zen experience. It's been commercialized, sadly. So I was reflecting during one of the presentations today on the fact that in New York City, there is a restaurant called the Buddha Bar. And you can Google it and see huge gold statues of the Buddha figure in this restaurant. And I couldn't help but think that, imagine if there was a restaurant called Christ's Restaurant or Christ on the Cross. And the figures in that restaurant were figures of Jesus on the cross. It would be closed promptly, right? And so the point back to authenticity is there has been quite a fair amount of commercial abuse of Buddhism and the philosophy, if you will, just sort of disrespectful in a sense. And so at the monastery, that I practice at, one of the things that I'm most pleased with is that we work extremely hard on making sure that the teachings are authentic and come from qualified teachers, right? It sounds a little snooty when I say it that way, but I think it's really important, because if you Google Zen anything, you'll find Zen dog training, you will find Zen restaurants, Zen bars, and intoxication and clouding the mind is one of the precepts for Western practitioners, in a sense like one of the commandments. It's not an order, it's kind of a rule for the road, the precepts. But the kind of, those sort of things happening in the context of a spiritual community are disturbing. So that's one of the characteristics of the organization I practice at. And one of the biggest things, and I kind of stepped over it as well, is it's a monastery. It is a monastery. The participants are cloistered. They stay there. They don't travel in and out of the monastery at will, except during breaks. And very much like a monastery in Japan, or even a monastery here in the United States, and many monasteries in the Christian tradition. Yeah. Well, Zen and Eastern practices definitely began as countercultural practices in this country. Although they began long ago in this country, they really took great force in the 60s and 70s. But they were very much part of the countercultural generation. And they stayed there for a very long time. They have been accepted in many ways, and as I mentioned, some of them inappropriate, like commercialization of the concepts. But I think they become much more and more accepted in communities in general. That's not to say completely. Even at this conference, I sense a lot of tension about acceptance and acceptability of Eastern religions and practices, and that's a point of tension for all of us practitioners that we have to resolve personally. But in terms of acceptance, yes, don't think there's much question about it. There's a current country song on the airwaves where someone speaks about yoga several times in the song, right? So yoga is a Hindu practice. And I don't think that's made clear in the song, but it's an Eastern practice. And I think in many ways, and yoga is an extraordinarily popular exercise practice, right, that exists now and certainly has taken a foothold in many, many places. So I would say mainstream, maybe not yet, but in terms of acceptability and credibility of the practices, and are they here to stay, I don't think there's any question about that at all. A fad, no. I think the understanding of the teachings of these religions, really, has been very broad and very serious for several decades. And so there are now bona fide Western practitioners of Eastern religions. Is it something that will fade? I think it's something that will find its appropriate place. And yoga, the common practice of it, has not found, a great following compared to the multitudes of people that practice yoga as a spiritual practice necessarily, although to many, yes. But I think it is seen as a form of exercise, a very popular one, especially for aging people. And that's not to suggest that young people shouldn't or don't practice it, but it definitely has a foothold there that isn't necessarily a spiritual foothold, but to very serious yoga practitioners, it is a hugely important spiritual practice. But I wouldn't compare it with sports or diversions or pastimes, right? So I wouldn't compare it with playing golf or fishing or things like that. One of the discussions here, one of the presentations, was about internal versus open or centered versus open meditative practices. And there can be meditative practices that open up completely on the world, and there can be meditative practices that focus deeply inside. And those practices are typically associated with different body positions, but meditation itself is a very diverse practice. So it can open up. There are exercises or practices for interdependency that are done in group, that are not done individually. So they're just an enormously wide breadth of what we've come to call, grouped together, and I think it's a terrific word, contemplative practices. And they run the range from things that are practiced in group, to things that are practiced alone and in silence and in very internally focused setting. Yeah. So when I hear the word mainstream, that automatically speaks to me as something that's fad, that something becomes popular, is covered exhaustively in the media. And when that happens, inevitably, it gets replaced with another fad. So,
maybe I should have said
yeah.
that.
But I'm not criticizing your characterization. It just, I know what you mean by mainstream, but from my seat, if you will, as a practitioner, if it went mainstream, I would just stay on my cushion and just let it kind of like do whatever it does out there, right, with regard to attention and interest, and then stay kind of true to what I believe my practice is. I think it, in a sense of mainstream, the Dalai Lama is one of the most recognized figures in the world. He may be the most recognized figure in the world, right? And so he's a Mahayana Buddhist leader. And, you would say that given that he's one of the most recognizable figures in the world, he's mainstream. And there are two things to comment on that. One is the inclusion of Eastern religious practices and religious studies now is just standard in terms of being mainstream. It's just accepted, if you will, that any discussion of religion is not complete without talking about major Eastern religions. But the broader issue, I think, of academic acceptance of contemplative practices is in education. And the educational approach, I believe, over the past 20 years has really been transformed. So when I went to school, we signed honor codes and things like that said we didn't work with other people. We worked alone, i.e. we didn't cheat, right? And so there was also a published code with clear consequences for violating that code. So learning was an individual act, right? And collective learning was called cheating, right? And when you get to the world and you get a job and you go out there, you go immediately from an individual environment, that is, I'm a student and I study and learn. I mean, often with, in communities of students, but in terms of tests and things like that, that's an individual thing, right? And then when you get to work, problems are solved by teams of people, right? And they have to be solved by teams of people. So my work was in the pharmaceutical industry, where we developed new drugs for unmet medical needs, which was an exciting thing to do as an engineer. And there were teams of chemists and engineers and microbiologists and all kinds of people that brought a new product from discovery through to FDA approval, or Eastern European Regulatory Agency approval, sorry. And that transition was really rough, going from I work alone to success is working in a team. So the university has recognized that over the past 20 years, with more and more work being done by groups of students working in teams, right? And so you guys must experience that, right? And so as a student, you're not very prepared when you come in from high school with how do I work as a team and what is appropriate team behavior. So at this conference, we've talked a lot about dialogue between people, this appreciative practice work that is done here, which is amazing. We've talked about listening as an important practice, and it is a spiritual, in a sense, practice, deeply listening to what someone is saying. And they're practices that are extremely important in just plain and simple success in the workplace when you get out. So we've seen in some what I would consider leading edge universities that are here talking about things, including this university, a lot of movement toward the adoption of contemplative practices and some of their tools and techniques, right? Not adoption of Buddhism as an engineering platform, right? But adoption of some of the tools and techniques that come out of it. And I think it's absolutely central to continued education, but it's part of a flow from individual study in the past, strict individual study, to team approaches to learning, to the actual world in which we solve problems together. So that transition, and the tools in the real world, right, if you will, as opposed to the classroom, right? Although that is a real world, but the tools in your career to do things are the kind of tools we talk about in terms of listening and dialogue and things like that, yeah? So adoption of these practices, I think, is consistent with the flow of education, right? And to see it in the engineering domain is amazing, right? Because we as engineers are very kind of boxy, linear, sequential people, right? Like, here is a problem. The problem has a very specific solution. You get it right or you get it wrong. There's a number associated with the answer, that sort of stuff. And so to see the adoption of and the utility of these tools and techniques in an applied science or an engineering domain is really amazing. I mean, just terrific. So I'm very optimistic about that continuing, and I'm hugely impressed with the leadership and the vision of the people who have started to do that here. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so the contributions of Buddhism to education and work. I think that Buddhism will sink into the American consciousness just as Christianity has done, right? And people won't walk around with 10 Commandments and the New Testament and things like that. That isn't how it works. But by way of upbringing and association with people of different traditions and faiths, the collective consciousness of the country changes. So I think Buddhism has made a mark already, especially in areas like the interdependence of things on this planet, right? And our own individual impact on the planet itself. I think those are concepts that are deeply grounded in Buddhist teachings. You don't have to say, this is Buddhism says there is interdependence, there is no individual element. Everything is an interdependent network. Now, you don't have to start with Buddhism says that, but sinking into the minds of many people are, this planet is becoming extraordinarily small, and we as human beings collectively have the ability to do terrible damage to it, right? And so what about our future? Once that realization of our power and the impact of what we do here on a distant part of the planet, then that sinks into people's consciousness and they become more and more aware of, hey, we all have to take care of the environment. So that, in a way, it's a little, I'm not explaining this as well as perhaps I could, but that's how Buddhist or Eastern practices, especially in the context of interdependence, impact our consciousness and our actions, legislation, and the mindset of people in the country as a whole. I think that these practices become adopted through success, fundamentally. And we can study and be curious about and like various concepts, but we adopt them and we come to believe in them when we see that they're successful. So one of the fascinating things that I've seen here at this conference already is evidence-based discussions around the value of these practices. So there are clinical studies that have shown the value of meditation-based stress reduction, right? There are studies that have shown the value of meditation-based improvements in health, in personal health. And so once those sort of things happen and you start to see concrete results, like the talk from Google this morning about they're teaching all of these mindfulness practices, these contemplative practices, to employees in the workplace. So that's a huge investment for them. Employees take time away from work. It costs money to give them the training, to develop the training courses. It costs money for the trainers, and they do that. They do that not because it's a nice thing to do. They do that because they believe there are outcomes associated with that training that help the company's bottom line, fundamentally. So it's not like we're a really nice company, so we do really nice things. Sometimes that happens, but it doesn't last. But when companies see the effect of these trainings on the behavior of their employees, a word that was used a lot this morning was productivity, right? So people see that by doing this, we become a more productive company. That's an outcome. And so they have demonstrated internally the outcomes associated with this. You saw this in the context as well of Fortune 500 versus other companies, just bona fide results that investors, individual investors, can use to make more money. Now that sounds a little crass, to make more money, but we live in a capitalistic society. And if you can show that the adoption of mindfulness practices or contemplative practices results in a stronger, more productive, higher growing company, then that takes a foothold. That's where it goes from a curiosity and something that may make a lot of sense to do in a general way to something that is a strategic advantage for a company to do, right? So those two areas that we've heard at the conference already, the area of investing in employees because of their productivity increases and health outcomes are pretty impressive, right? We'll see more and more of that, I think, and then these practices will become more and more accepted. Yeah. But only through that. Right? The rest of it, this is a good philosophy, this makes sense, this is compassionate, this is the right thing to do, that sort of general reasoning, that suffers in difficult times in companies and in organizations. But this increases productivity, that always has a voice. Yeah, so that is the question. Should we adopt this because it's a superior ethical practice, or should we adopt this because it makes us more money, right? So the choice there is pretty obvious, I think, in terms of what would be the right thing to do. But in a pragmatic way, just going back to engineering education, right? You want to see an outcome, and this practice creates this outcome, and that's very important. For me, I kind of connect these two worlds in the following way, that the mindfulness practices that are being taught in companies are based on universal truths that come from ancient religions, right? About how the world works. So we've heard the Buddha mentioned many times throughout the day, and his very simple yet powerful teachings. So those teachings or truths, as we call them, can be applied in many, many settings because they speak to fundamental laws of the world. So if those laws are taken and applied to developing your employees in a company, that's okay, right? One's intent, that is to make money, if you will, or to create a stronger company, that can be a positive thing as well, yeah? And so that's the connection, really, is the religion speaks to fundamental truths. Many, many different religions speak to fundamental truths and wisdom traditions, and those truths can be applied to a variety of situations. When applied to a situation, they result in an advantage because you're applying a law of nature to them. And that's what I think companies fundamentally have to see. Yeah. So the further growth of contemplative practices, I think, will occur naturally. What's amazing to me about this conference is already how much growth has occurred and how much credibility has been established for all these practices in very wide variety of settings. Scientific settings, educational settings, it's just amazing how many dedicated people there are out there that are openly using these tools and techniques. And so I think that just will continue to occur. When you hear stories about CEOs using contemplative practices and studying them, then you know that people see enormous power in the tools and techniques. Yeah, very, very exciting to see it. Because from the practitioner's standpoint, the more and more people that practice this, right? So in the context of Buddhism, well, the less suffering there is in the world, right? Because that's what the goal of Mahayana, a form of Buddhism, is to reduce suffering, to alleviate suffering. Yeah. Well, actually, all Buddhist practices have that as their primary goal. Well, I think just in finishing, I made a comment to a colleague of mine who was here as well last night after we began, and in seeing the breadth of the program and just the quality of the presentations from the abstracts and the like, I really was amazed at how far we've come in 20 years. It just is unbelievable, right? And the joke I said to him was, we were born 20 years too early, because now it's really taking off and we get to see the power and the excitement and the enthusiasm and the kind of institutionalization of these practices, right? And I think that is happening. And what I see is 40 years worth of work from the Zen teachers that came from Japan to the United States in the 60s and early 70s. From all of that work, very hard work over many decades, you see its impact. And it's like it's here and it'll stay. Yeah, great stuff, huh?